G'day painters, welcome back to Bellamar's Miniatures. This week I'm painting the Barbarian from HeroQuest. Let's paint. The largest part of this model is his flesh, so that's where I start. This model was painted a while back, I've just not found time to edit the video before now, so none of these paints will be from the Army Painter Fanatic range. As always, all the paints I use on it will be in the description. Next I did the leather parts. This was the back part of his skirt, the straps on his arms and legs, and his sandals and sandal straps. Then it was electric blue for the other part of the skirt. I'm doing these models as a commission, so I'm trying to stay close to the box art as was requested. Otherwise, I think I'd do this a different colour. I don't feel like the blue works great here. A different colour would pop nicely. All the fur bits I block in with stone golem. I didn't want to go with a darker grey for the base as it's all up against the leather, and something like uniform grey as an example, it's a very similar tone and it wouldn't give a lot of definition between the different parts. You want the parts to be easily recognisable from the tabletop. He has black hair, but I don't like starting from black, so I use Necromancer Cloak to block the hair in. I'm being very careful here as it'll be a pain to clean up with the skin colour since it's so light and it doesn't cover great. For the belt, I wanted it to be a leather, but it needed to be a different colour to the other leather parts, just to break it up a bit and add a bit of variety. So here came oak brown. There's not much metal on this model, it's just the sword and a metal plate on one of his arm straps. Not a lot of gold either. I use greedy gold for what there is. It's mostly the weapon filigree and the icon on his belt. For washes, I use flesh wash for the majority of the model. Everything except the silver, the blue, and his hair got hit with flesh wash. One advantage to the majority of the model being a brownish colours is getting away with using a single wash for most of it. For the blue and the silver, I use blue tone. I decided to use blue tone for the silver just to add a bit more colour to the model. There are a lot of brown tones on this model, and I thought a blue tint to the silver will help a bit. I was pretty happy with the result, and I think it was worth it. For the hair, I use dark tone. This is going to give the hair a shiny finish, but not only do I finish the models with a matte varnish spray, I also brush on some matte varnish later just to make sure it finishes nice and matte rather than stupidly shiny as it is now. After the washes, my first step was going back to Barbarian Flesh to tidy up the mid-tone. Looking back, I'm not sure this step was necessary. I did a pretty light wash and I was careful about pushing it into the recesses. If your mid-tone is still pretty neat, then you could skip this step if you wanted. But I don't think it was a waste of time. Since it's a commission, it's worth giving it a bit of extra attention. Next, with Elven Flesh, I finished the highlights. Well, I thought I finished the highlights, but more on that later. I picked out the top of the muscles and most of the raised parts to help build that definition and show where the light would be hitting. The Elven Flesh is a fair jump up from the Barbarian Flesh, so when doing it, it's worth thinning your paint down a lot to make the gradient smoother. You can keep doing more layers in smaller areas till you reach the highlight you're happy with, while having a nice gradient too. Then with electric blue, I highlight the blue skirt. Here I mostly do an edge highlight, but I also highlight the part across his leg that's facing upwards. That part would definitely be getting hit by the light. Then with the stone golem, it's the same deal, re-establishing the mid-tone of the furs, making sure to leave the shade in the recesses, and building up that gradient nicely. You wouldn't believe it, but I do the same thing with the leather brown. I mostly focused on an edge highlight here, but a few of the parts that are more obviously facing upwards get more of a highlight. I also pick out the folds on the skirt to help them pop too. The leather part of the skirt has this nice texture to it that the wash has picked out really nicely, so I don't want to do too much work on it or I'll probably lose that. Then I use white to do the final highlights on the fur. Often you'll dry brush fur, but I wouldn't try it on this model. I feel like the positioning of the fur would make it too messy and you'll mess up the other parts that you've already finished. So just take your time, work around the model, and carefully pick out the top parts of the fur. While I was working with the white, I also picked out his eyes too. Then with Necromancer Cloak, I picked out the pupils of his eyes and highlighted his hair. Because of the shininess from the wash, it can be a bit hard to see the highlights here, but I'm just carefully picking out the strands of hair while leaving the recesses the darker colour. When it's hit with a matte varnish later, it'll be much easier to see. Then for the final highlights on the hair, I use Stone Golem. In the artwork, it looks like he is starting to go grey, which is why I chose a lighter grey for the final highlights. Plus, it was already on my palette, so that's always a bonus. With this, I'm just picking out the very edges of his hair. It's a very minor highlight, don't go too crazy on it. Then I varnish the hair. You can immediately see the difference, and once it dries, it will be even more obvious. You probably don't need to do this if you're going to matte varnish the whole model, but at this point I wasn't totally sure if my friend wanted them varnished or not, so I figured it was best to be safe and do it to fix the shininess now. With Shining Silver, I highlighted the sword and the golds. I just did an edge highlight along the edge of the blade and picked out the ridge running down the middle. I liked the blue tone I'd gotten for the sword and didn't want to lose it, so I went pretty light with highlights. And then for the gold, it was a very minor edge highlight. I decided I wasn't entirely happy with the level of the highlights on the skin. The skin is the main part of the model, so it should really pop. So I did a 50-50 mix of white and elven flesh and gave it another highlight, just working in the smallest areas and picking out the muscles to help them pop that bit better. Then with skeletal bone, I picked out his toenails. The toenails are surprisingly big on this model, so they were pretty easy to pick out. Time for the base. I use oak brown to block in the majority of the base. Oak brown doesn't cover the best across such a flat surface, so it takes 2 coats. The rock I block in with uniform grey. Make sure to take your time around the foot and the ground. You don't want to go messing up something else now when you're so close to being done. I use strong tone over the entire base, including the rock. Honestly, you probably don't need to do it over the flat part of the base. There isn't really any texture for it to pick out. I did it just because I knew I'd probably get some onto the brown when I was doing the rock, so it was easier to do it all just to keep it consistent. Then I broke out green tone to give some of the base a green tint. I do this on both the flat part and the rock. Just in spots where some moss might grow, it helps break up the base a little and just give that bit of life to it. While I wait for the washes to dry, I paint the base rim black. It feels weird that this isn't the last step. The model is supposed to be finished once I paint the rim black. However, to finish the model, it's just a light dry brush of stone golem on the rocks. I'm just looking out to pick the very edges and build a little bit of that definition. And he's done! No turntable for this guy. I didn't get the turntable till after I'd already given these models back to my friend, so we'll just have to settle for me doing it manually. I hope you've enjoyed the video and it's given you some ideas for your HeroQuest Barbarian, or maybe a different model. If you've watched this far, why not give the video a like? And if you'd like to see the rest of the HeroQuest heroes painted, then subscribe so you can see when the rest of the videos come out. Thanks for watching, catch you in the next video.